Today, I'm going to explain a horror, sci-fi film, thriller film called Life. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. A team of astronauts aboard the International Space Station prepares to intercept the Pilgrim, a satellite capsule returning from Mars. The Pilgrim carries soil samples from Mars, and what the astronauts hope carries confirmation of life from the Red Planet. Intercepting the Pilgrim and finding out whether or not life is possible on Mars is the team's primary objective. Unfortunately, the Pilgrim is damaged and veers off course. Rory suits up and prepares for a spacewalk. He would be outside the space station, controlling a mechanical arm to catch the Pilgrim. The space station is filled with tension as the astronauts navigate the station, all rushing into their posts. Their commander, Ekaterina, and another astronaut, Sho, are at the station's command center, overseeing the operation. The other astronauts watch intently as the station moves into position to intercept the Pilgrim. David, the station doctor, monitors Rory's vital signs. He, along with the lead scientist, Hugh, watch Rory from a window. Anxiety fills the station as they finally see the Pilgrim capsule approaching the station. Rory navigates the arm into position, and as the Pilgrim barrels in and makes contact, the whole station jolts back. The astronauts are pushed back, but as they gather back at the window, they see Rory has caught the Pilgrim. Cheers and smiles are exchanged as Ekaterina announces to NASA that the Pilgrim capsule has successfully landed on the station. At the laboratory, Hugh carefully takes samples from a container and places them under a microscope. He discovers an organism almost fossilized in the sample. He describes it as something similar to a single-cell organism. Hugh tries reanimating the organism, but it doesn't react. He then tries mimicking an atmosphere closer to a Proterozoic Earth and adding in a growth hormone. To everyone's surprise, the organism starts moving. Hugh can't help but giggle, as they've confirmed life from a different planet. The team later goes into a call from Earth. News outlets and large crowds are all celebrating the discovery of extraterrestrial life. The astronauts chat with students announcing that their school had been given an extraordinary chance to name the Martian. The kid declares that they decided to name the organism Calvin. After the call, the astronauts resume their tasks. Hugh and Rory bicker while trying to fix plumbing. Meanwhile, another doctor, Miranda, checks on David's health. Miranda is concerned because David had been on the station for a significant length of time, almost breaking the world record for the longest time in space. David says he doesn't mind, as he prefers staying on the space station. He feels like he belongs there. They continue testing the organism the following day. Hugh found that Calvin has grown rapidly, now consisting of hundreds of cells and developing a neural network. Hugh notes that each of Calvin's cells can perform every somatic function independently, meaning each of Calvin's cells are simultaneously a muscle cell, a nerve cell, and a photoreceptive cell. Calvin is a creature that is all brain, all muscle, and all eyes. Calvin has also developed to have appendages, and Hugh tries making contact. The crew watches anxiously as Hugh plays around with the alien creature. The crew later has dinner while Sho calls his wife, who's currently undergoing labor. Sho then introduces everyone to his newborn daughter. The crew then heads into their quarters, each tending to themselves. David examines himself for injuries and ailments. Sho continues his call with his family, and Hugh is back at the lab, interacting with Calvin. Several weeks pass, and the station is rocked by an alarm. Rory, Miranda, and Hugh all rush to the lab. Rory heads in and fixes the malfunction, and Hugh admits he must have overseen something for the lab to malfunction. Miranda stresses the importance of keeping Calvin contained as they don't fully understand it yet. Hugh is irked, saying they shouldn't liken Calvin to a disease, but Rory gets annoyed, saying that Calvin is an alien species and that Hugh shouldn't grow too attached. Later, Miranda makes a note that Calvin has now become dormant after weeks of sustained growth. They suspect that Calvin may have gone to hibernation as a defense mechanism when the lab malfunctioned. She says she is relieved as the creature was growing too fast. This pause in its growth has given her and the crew time to review their containment procedures. Calvin and the lab must remain sealed off at all times. Miranda expresses that the health of everyone on board far outweighs any harm to Calvin. Hugh discusses Calvin with Miranda. He stresses the importance of their mission in studying Calvin's cells. He poses that Calvin could unlock the secret to curing any disease or potentially healing every ailment. He proposes giving Calvin a small electric shock to awaken it. In the lab, Hugh prepares to electrocute Calvin. After several shocks, Calvin springs awake, latching to Hugh's hand and breaking the electric wand. The crew tries to remain calm as Calvin grips Hugh's hand. Hugh tries pulling, but Calvin maintains a tight grip. Hugh starts shouting in pain as Calvin starts squeezing. Calvin begins folding Hugh's fingers into unnatural shapes, and Hugh begins begging for help. The crew wants to head in and help, but Miranda tells them they can't risk placing another crew member in danger. As the crew argues, Calvin breaks Hugh's hand. Hugh then starts floating, unconscious, his hand a mangled mess. In the container, Calvin tries breaking free. It uses a piece of the broken electric wand to pierce one of the gloves. Calvin breaks free, leaving everyone in utter shock. Calvin makes its way to a lab rat specimen. It suddenly attacks, wrapping itself around the rat and digesting it. Rory enters the lab, fetching Hugh. David receives Hugh but has to close the lab door before Rory makes it out as he sees Calvin latch itself on Rory's leg. Rory then gets an oxygen candle, hoping to burn Calvin off his leg. He burns Calvin, and it jumps off. Ekaterina then gives the other to kill the alien. Rory takes an incinerator and prepares to flame Calvin. He starts hunting the alien, bathing it with flame. Calvin runs around the lab, hiding, but Rory chases after it. Rory corners the alien, believing to have Calvin trapped in a container. Rory discovers the container empty, and Calvin pops up behind him. The alien grabs Rory's face and makes its way into Rory's mouth. Rory begins choking, and the crew watches in horror, unable to help. A large amount of blood spews out of Rory's mouth as he floats lifelessly in the lab. The incinerator triggers a fire alarm, and fire suppressant gas fills the lab. Calvin exits Rory, now appearing to have grown 100-fold. Sho and the commander try manually closing the gas as Calvin could use the gas holes as a way out. As the final valve closes, Calvin reaches it and squeezes out. Ekaterina sends out a distress call to NASA, but Sho sees the transmission has failed. They would need to venture out to fix it. Ekaterina suits up and heads out. She reaches the transmitter and sees it has overheated. She opens the coolant chamber and sees it empty. She surmises that Calvin could have reached the coolant. Hugh, now conscious, theorizes that Calvin may have consumed the coolant for sustenance. As they talk, Calvin launches itself out of the coolant chamber and latches onto Ekaterina. Ekaterina makes her way back to the station airlock, but she notices liquid in her suit. Calvin has ruptured her coolant tube, and Ekaterina realizes she could drown soon. Liquid starts inhibiting her vision, and she decides to leap for the airlock. Liquid coolant floods into Ekaterina's helmet, and she starts drowning. David rushes to the airlock to meet Ekaterina, and Miranda warns him that Ekaterina may be frantic and irrational. Ekaterina makes it to the airlock, and David advises her to help him unlock the airlock. To David's surprise, she starts turning the airlock's lever in the opposite direction. Miranda realizes that Ekaterina is deliberately locking herself out to save the crew from Calvin. Ekaterina eventually drowns, and David and Miranda watch her float away. Calvin jumps back to the ship, and David weeps in frustration. Hugh tries calming everyone down, telling them Calvin has been outside far too long for any creature to survive. Sho tells them Calvin could still enter the station through the thrusters. They monitor the thrusters, and each time a thruster experiences a temperature change, Sho ignites it. Unfortunately, all the thruster blasting causes the station to veer off, and Sho has to use the remaining fuel to put the station back in orbit. This allows Calvin to sneak back into the station. Hugh realizes that Calvin's species must have dominated Mars for millions of years but went into hibernation when Mars' atmosphere collapsed. He proposes they should simulate the same on the station to force Calvin back into hibernation. They would retreat to one capsule, seal themselves off, and expel the oxygen from the rest of the station. They retreat to a capsule and seal everything off. Miranda notices Hugh getting weaker. Hugh blames himself for what happened, but David says it was a team decision to take Calvin. Hugh says Calvin isn't their enemy as it's only trying to survive. And for it to survive, it must kill them. Hugh gets weaker and passes out. The crew tries to help stabilize Hugh, but Miranda notices something moving in Hugh's leg. She unzips Hugh's pants and finds Calvin feeding on Hugh's leg. They all jump back. Miranda uses a defibrillator to shock Calvin, but it only catches the alien's attention. They rush out and get split up, and Sho gets stranded in the sleeping pods. David and Miranda return to Hugh, and David sees that Hugh would soon pass. David sees Calvin moving through the ship in a hologram. Calvin had accidentally swallowed Hugh's tracker, leaving Miranda and David the ability to track the creature. They then lock themselves off and purge oxygen from the other compartments. Calvin starts suffocating when they suddenly get a proximity warning. They look out the window and see a Soyuz shuttle docking with the station. Miranda reveals that the Soyuz isn't there to rescue them but to push them into deep space. It is a final security measure ensuring no alien life would ever reach Earth. Believing the shuttle docking is a rescue mission, Sho leaves his sleeping chamber and rushes to the Soyuz. As he tries to get the hatch open, Calvin sneaks up behind him. Miranda and David hurry to Sho but are too late. They see the cosmonauts inside the Soyuz getting devoured and Sho trying to make his way back out. The Soyuz breaks away, and the seal between the two stations fails. The station begins decompressing, and Sho starts getting sucked out. Calvin suddenly latches onto Sho's leg and starts climbing. As Calvin gets closer to Miranda, Sho decides to grab Calvin and allow himself to get sucked back. Sho falls and gets sucked into space, but Calvin manages to cling to the station. David helps Miranda climb up and manages to lock Calvin out. The station starts falling apart, and parts and debris fly everywhere. David sees that all the chaos has once again pushed the station into the Earth, leaving them about 30 minutes before the station re-enters the atmosphere. With depleting oxygen, David gets an idea. Calvin is searching for oxygen, so they could probably use the oxygen candles to lure it. He plans to lure Calvin to one of the escape pods and launch himself into deep space with Calvin. Miranda would then get into a different pod and land back on Earth to tell everyone what happened. They initiate their plan, and David heads out with an oxygen candle. David carefully traverses the station, and Calvin shows up and hugs his oxygen candle. David flees and uses another oxygen candle to lure Calvin. David gets to the escape pod, and Calvin rushes in and hugs him. Seeing that David has made it to the pod, Miranda begins making her way to the other pod. David launches his pod, and he begins heading into deep space. Miranda then launches, and they start separating. In a black box recording, Miranda narrates what happened in the station. She recommends treating all Martian life as dangerous and hostile and advises to use all possible means to kill Calvin if it ever reaches Earth. Both capsules run into debris, and both begin malfunctioning. Calvin grabs David's hand, but he tries his best to maintain his trajectory. Miranda descends, but her pod's navigation systems start malfunctioning. The two pods drift farther apart. David screams in agony as Calvin wraps around his arm. One pod finally enters the atmosphere while the other flies off into space. The pod ends up crash landing in the ocean. Fishermen see the pod descending and approach it. In the pod, they see David covered in tendrils of flesh. In space, Miranda continues veering off. The fishermen work together to get the pod opened, and David tries to discourage them, but they can't understand him. More fishing boats approach the pod, unknowingly bringing themselves closer to their, and the planet's, doom.